Air warfare in Hearts of Iron 4 sucks donkey even more so than the first video I made about it. The closest thing my unwoke Eastern European brain can compare it to is a woman. You like the way it looks, you like to play with its different parts and try out different things, you might eventually even fall in love, but fundamentally, you never come to truly understand it. And the game's not helping you either. Tooltips about stats lack detail and are sometimes wrong, aircraft modules are hidden in seemingly unrelated text, and while wiki pages have some cool info, they're often outdated. On top of that, you have every YouTuber under the sun making tests with questionable results, Junior here included, so nobody will blame you if you're sitting there thinking, what am I doing in this ocean of chaos called life? Or what's the best meta fighter design? Or why is this intro taking so goddamn long? After doing a crap ton of research, I can only answer the second of these questions, but I can also help you get better at air combat and thus get better at Hearts of Iron 4, because the difference that planes make is sky high. After watching this blubbering behemoth of a video, you will know how air combat affects your army and navy, how the aircraft designer works, what do the different stats mean and which are the best planes for single and multiplayer, how air missions differ, how to transmute base metals into gold, why your parents divorced, and so much more. Everything is timestamped, so find what you need and get on with your day. One last thing before we start. While I learned a lot about their system, I'm not perfect and some of this info might be outdated because of patches. If you notice that something is wrong or outdated with this video, please leave a comment. I will include your contribution and your name in the pinned comment below. My ambition is to make this video the place where people go to get truthful and relevant information about air combat, but I cannot do this without you. So thanks in advance, make sure to check the pinned comments, and with that out of the way,
let's take this party downstairs.
Like and subscribe. Alright, champ, we gotta start somewhere, so we might as well start with the basics. Let's begin with the what, where, and why of air combat. So what's air combat? That's combat that happens between airplanes. Where does it happen? In the air. Bang! If you couldn't tell by now, I will be attending the Nobel Prize award ceremony this year. Now, if you want to be more specific about where air combat happens, you can press F3 to reveal the strategic air map mode, or click on this little planey icon like the filthy casual that you are. As you can see, this mode divides the map into different regions which are called strategic air regions. On land, these strategic air regions differ in size and composition to just about anything else you see, including the states map mode, the default map mode, etc. However, once you're at sea, you will notice that the air and naval regions are exactly the same in size, and this is made by design. When you left click on an air region, a new window will appear showing a whole bunch of things. From top to bottom, these include the name of the air region, the type and number of planes and anti-aircraft guns both on your side here in green to the left and on the enemy side, which is to the right, and this is in the color of my penis. Yeah, it's kind of weirdly darker than the skin in other regions of my body. I guess this is what happens when you don't use lube. Anyway, in the top midsection you have the time of day, which is displayed here. Also weather conditions will display here, and a bar that shows what percentage of air superiority you have. If you're below 40 like we're right now, the air region will glow in red. If you're between 40 and 60%, as we will be in a minute, it will glow in yellow, and if you're above 60%, the air region will glow in green to just give you an indication of how the war on the air is going. Now you might be wondering why in this case I'm only, let's see, 22.4%, considering that we have 2,000 planes on each side. This is because of the currently lower mission efficiency that you see here, also because of the currently lower air detection. In this case specifically, the thing that's affecting these two stats the most is that the airplanes that I've chosen have recently switched air regions, so there's a rapidly decaying penalty that you can see when you hover your mouse over here. You see recently arrived in region, and this penalty decays by 3.7% per hour, meaning that in less than 20 hours we will be at 100% mission efficiency. My lower mission efficiency and air detection is also one of the many factors that will determine why I will lose more planes against the enemy who has the exact same range and exact same aircraft in the first hours after I impulse the game, like so. I've lost 14 while they've lost only 5, but now my air mission efficiency and air detection is getting better thanks to the rapidly decaying penalty. Still, I'll get to the specifics a bit later, as there are many things that affect your detection and mission efficiency. So the top part where you see the fighters here is the so-called air superiority zone, while the lower zone will display the so-called ground missions or effects such as how many troops you've bombed, anti-aircraft casualties, bomber disruption, and so on. You can toggle this section to show results results from your missions or the enemy's missions. And you can even toggle what missions this window will display by turning these on or off. Right now, there's nothing going on at the bottom part of the display because we don't have any bombers or anti-aircraft guns active. But if they were, they would display there. Once you click on details in the middle, you will see statistics about the buildings and troops you've bombed, how many airplanes you and the enemy have lost, how many bombers you've disrupted or they've disrupted, destroyed trains, trucks, and railway guns, and so on. Yes, you can even destroy railway guns with your Air Force, which is quite nifty. However, if you want the graph up here to display anything, you will have to click on each individual stat that you want tracked. And after we unpause here, you will see that a graph will form. The days toggle tracks losses occurred up to 30 days, while the months and the years toggles give you a more long-term perspective of how the air war is going. And one last thing to discuss in terms of tracking your stats, keep in mind that air combat happens 3 times per day, meaning that you see these numbers change 3 times per day, once at 8 AM, once at 4 PM, and once around midnight to simulate a nightly round of fighting, which is characterized by lower detection. Now, you can increase detection in various ways, but we'll cover that in a bit. Alright, so let's focus on the why of air combat, or the reason that makes it worth for you to build airplanes instead of just producing a bigger and better army or navy. In a nutshell, the way that air power affects your ground troops is massive. By using air superiority and ground attacks, you can boost the stats of your army and debuff the enemy's army, and this can have a massive effect on the ground war. You can also reduce the enemy's supply lines to rubble with logistical strikes, damage buildings with strategic bombing, attack enemy ships at sea or in port, lay or sweep naval mines, and get air recon, which gives a bunch of additional bonuses for combat and detection for your army and navy. To prove that I'm not some shady representative of Boeing or Lockheed Martin trying to sell you on airplanes, let's conduct a little test. I've set up 3 fully equipped and entrenched Polish armies to defend this little perimeter, and we'll use the German armies to attack with forced attack on so they don't disengage. Let's observe what kind of effect air superiority and ground attacks have on combat stats. So I'm using 3.4 thousand multi-role aircraft that can conduct both air superiority and ground attack missions. We'll discuss the design a bit later. Now let's focus on the effects that they have. We're putting them up to fight in Western Poland on the air superiority mission. Let's let some time elapse and let's check out how they affect the battle results. So with just air superiority, no ground attacks, we can see that the enemy divisions have a 28% penalty to their defensive stats. Also, when we tack on Poland and check one of the divisions, you can see that their max speed is currently 2.4 kilometers, and you have a 30% reduction in the enemy division speed, which can be massive if you're trying to encircle their armies and they're trying to escape. By having air superiority over an enemy, you will slow their armies down and you will make it easier for you to break through and create a gap in their defense, which you can exploit with blitzkrieg tactics to envelop the enemy, reduce their supply, and ultimately defeat their armies. Keep in mind that if it was the other way around and the Polish were attacking the Germans, having air superiority over them would reduce their breakthrough instead of their defense. Another thing that's good to know about air superiority is how it's calculated. Every point of air superiority that you have gives the enemy a 0.7% penalty to either the defense or breakthrough, depending on the attacking side, as we discussed up until now. And this penalty can be increased with air doctrines. For example, you might have a situation where the air zone is glowing in yellow, and you're thinking that all is equal, and then you discover that you only have 40% air superiority, which will reduce the stats of your troops despite the game signaling to you that the airspace is still in high contention. So it's best to not always rely on the colors of the air zone and monitor the progress of the air war if you can help it. Lastly, you will not be able to conduct certain missions if you don't have enough air superiority, such as dropping paratroopers. You only can do it once you have at least 70% air superiority. For nukes dropped with strategic bombers, that value is increased to 75%, and also doing port strikes requires at least 30% air superiority as well. So now let's see what happens when we switch from air superiority to close air support. Keep in mind that when you're doing close air support, you will still apply a power projection factor to your air superiority. It's absolutely the same as in the air superiority mission. So even CAS, close air support, and tactical bombers will apply air superiority. However, if they're undefended by fighters, or if they're not multi-role several fighters that I'm using currently, they will get shot down by enemy fighters fast, so you need to defend your close air support troops and tactical bombers with your own fighters in order to retain that air superiority and to bomb effectively. Anyways, we're going to check the combat stats again. We'll let some time elapse. Some of the fights have stopped, but let's see this one. So what do we see here now? Our soft attack, which is the ability of our armies to attack soft troops, meaning infantry that's not guarded by any armor, has been improved by a massive 35%. Our hard attacks is also improved, which translates to our army's ability to attack armored units. Our breakthrough, which translates to defense on the attack, or how much damage your troops can take while attacking, has also been increased by 35%. Combine this with the reduction of the enemy's defensive stats and you can see how powerful air forces can be. In addition, when we do ground attacks, we attack the enemy's troops directly, meaning that we do damage to their equipment, to their manpower, and to their organization. Organization is a stat that allows divisions to fight for longer, so by reducing it, we disrupt the enemy's ability to stand their ground or to be more effective in attacking. While damaging their strength reduces their equipment and manpower, which ultimately makes the divisions even weaker. So we have so many effects that work for you when you apply your air force effectively. Of course, that does not mean that your air force can't be countered in any way. For example, the Polish army can include some anti-aircraft battalions into their divisions, which can dramatically reduce the effect that our air force has on them, meaning that they'll get lesser debuffs, less damage on their organization and strength, and they can also shoot down our airplanes. Bad weather also has a negative effect on your air force, and the different types of terrain when you do ground missions can also dramatically reduce the effectiveness of your air force. For example, we can see that Warsaw is an urban province, which when we hover over here, you can see that enemy air support has a massive 50% reduction in its effectiveness. So when we're attacking here on the plains, we have no such penalties, but while we're attacking in Warsaw, they will be 50% less effective. The topic of how to reduce the enemy's air force effectiveness through ground troops and buildings is something that deserves a video of its own, so I won't dive into all the details here. When it comes to using your air force in combination with your navy, most of us think of slapping some planes on the decks of a carrier, and no wonder. Carrier fleets were an extremely innovative way to conduct warfare during World War II, and their potency is quite well represented in game. You can use fighters, naval bombers, and even close air support aircraft to turn these carriers into a floating airfield, projecting air power across the seas. Keep in mind that only aircraft designed on the carrier airframe are eligible to be used on carrier ships. Battleship fleets usually don't do great against carrier strike forces, as planes launched from these carriers can use their speed and range to do a lot of damage before the two fleets even see each other. Still, if you want to run a powerful battleship fleet, one of the things you can do is to design a long-range heavy fighter to protect your ships from carrier-launched aircraft in order for you to get in range and use the battleship's big guns to great effect. Additionally, long-range naval bombers can be used to hunt down enemy submarines, attack convoys, and lay or remove mines from the sea zones. But keep in mind that these aircraft are quite expensive to produce and that destroyer ships do a much better job at mine warfare than planes. Also, the minelaying and minesweeping techs for airplanes are researched quite late in the game, 1941 and 1944 respectively. In general, if you want to use aircraft with your navy, I suggest focusing on fighters, naval bombers, planes that do naval recon, and just leave it at that. Still, you can always go absolutely crazy in single player, bud. I mean, the world is your oyster at this point. So we will take a look at some of the wacky designs later on in this abortion of a video, probably around 35 hours in. Yeah, I'm starting to lose it at this point. Alright boysies, it's time to open our first big can of worms. We're gonna find out how airplane stats really work, which will probably cause you to look at Paradox with different eyes from here on out. Although most of you who have played the game long enough know what's up by now. It's also possible that I may say something wrong here because it's confusing even after putting in hours of research, so let me know in the comments if you notice anything. But don't blame Paradox for this mess, they're just victims. Victims of sloppiness, and don't get me wrong, I do love love the game and I owe my thanks to the studio for it, but is it really that hard to write better tooltips for your main audience, which is English speaking, so everyone can understand what the hell is going on? Rant over. Let's get on with it and you'll see what I mean, starting with the very first stat, max speed. What does the tooltip say? How quickly this unit can traverse terrain under optimal circumstances. What an informative tooltip. I'm sure anyone who's new to the game will understand that having higher top speed than the enemy will give you not one but 2 damage bonuses. Moving over to agility now. Agility affects how easy it is to hit another plane and how easy it can be to avoid being hit. Everything is clear, right? You got the fact that having lower agility than your enemy's planes will give you a penalty to the damage that you deal? Oh, you didn't? How many clairvoyance classes have you missed wanking after Hermione? Jeez. We'll talk more about speed and agility in a minute because they modify your base damage, so we have to understand how that one works first. In a nutshell, base damage is formulated by taking 20% of the air attack value of each plane that you send in an air zone. So if we take a look at this example, we have 24 air attack here, meaning that 20% of it is going to be 4.8. So this plane has a base damage of 4.8. When you send 100 of these airplanes to an air zone, you will have 480 base attack. If you send 1,000, it's gonna be 4.8k, right? It's simple enough. I'm gonna show you the formula on the screen as well so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Once the game calculates your base damage, the next step is to include the damage modifiers from agility and top speed. Both agility and top speed are comparative stats, meaning that they only work when you're fighting against other aircraft because the game has to compare who has the higher agility and top speed to determine which side gets the damage reductions and increases. Let's tackle agility first. With this plane we have 44 agility. So if, for example, you're up against a fighter with 60 agility, the game will take your base damage, multiply it by 30%, and then multiply it again either by the, here we open the parentheses, agility difference between the two fighter models divided by the attacking side, close the parentheses, or by 2. Meaning that when we subtract 52.36 from 480, we're going to be left with a base attack of 427.64. I mean, it might sound difficult at first, but it's really basic math. And the only annoying thing is that there are so many modifiers that alter your base damage that it's kind of hard to calculate in your head. But these modifiers are there essentially to simulate an authentic air war where there's a lot of different factors such as weather, detection, damage, you know, different stats of the fighters, etc, etc. So overall, it's a good thing. The bad thing is that it's badly explained by Paradox. That's my only gripe with it. Now let's move over to max speed. As I mentioned earlier, having higher speed than the enemy gets you 2 bonuses, and the formulas for these two are quite similar to how the game compares your agility to the enemy. In order to keep this video as compact as possible, I'll display the formulas on screen right now, and if you need an example where I do the calculations, just go back to 3 minutes to see how we did the agility penalty, and you can apply the same principles here. Now here's the kicker, or the really super fun part. The formulas that I showed you for agility and for top speed are sourced from the Paradox wiki, which takes them from the game's define files. I checked and they are identical there, but the thing is, Paradox devs like to make patches where they say that they've tweaked some of the values in these formulas, but don't mention how exactly they've tweaked them. In other words, it's anyone's guess whether top speed and agility are calculated exactly with these values, but at least you get a good idea of how it works. From the latest patches from late 2022 and early 2023, we understand that top speed is a bit more important than agility now, but they kind of go hand in hand with the airframes and engines that you use, so you should prioritize both as they're really strong. When you design fighters, which are essential for any air force, you can sacrifice a tiny bit of agility for air attack, but I wouldn't recommend losing too much or any top speed. Alright, let's move over to the most criminally underrated airplane stat in the freaking game. Range. Range is crucial for the mission efficiency of all your aircraft, particularly fighters and bombers. In essence, it affects how many of the planes you send to an air zone will actually participate in dogfights and bombings, which can be massive. Let me demonstrate. We have Germany and France with the same 2,500 airplanes fighting over Benelux region. They have the same doctrines, no air advisors, virtually everything is equal. The only difference is that I've moved some of the French fighters to be further away so they don't cover the entire Benelux region, meaning they have 85% mission efficiency against Germany's 100%. The way the game works is that your planes need to have enough range to cover the entirety of a strategic air zone or each of these little tiles that you see in order to maximize their mission efficiency. It doesn't matter if the front line is fully within the radius of your aircraft. If you don't cover everything within the air zone in which you're trying to project air power to, you are going to be fighting in suboptimal conditions. For example, if you send 2,000 aircraft with 50% mission efficiency and the enemy also has 2,000 with 100% mission efficiency, you will lose hard as the enemy can essentially fight you 2-on-1, and this penalty can go up to 3 against 1. So in short, you're screwed. By the end of the test, France has lost nearly all of its fighters while Germany has 1,000 left. Yikes. So yes, having enough range is going to be a boost for both your defense and offense, meaning that you should not ignore it for aircraft built on small airframes. Medium and large airframes usually have more than enough range, so there you can concentrate on slapping armor plates for extra air defense. But in general, it's best to build light aircraft with decent range as they're considerably cheaper and have more top speed and agility than heavy fighters built on medium airframes. In other words, light fighters will always have the advantage over heavy ones unless they are with super short range. I'll continue my range tangent once we take a look at some of the more optimal designs. Just be aware that this stat is absolutely vital for effective air combat, especially when you venture into foreign land on the attack. It's time for a bonus game! Stare at this screen for a second. Oh no, did you see the air mission efficiency suddenly drop massively? Why do you think that happened? Was it A, low fuel, B, somebody bombed our airbase, or C, those ding dang dong no gremlins sneaked into our hangars and damaged the engines again? If you answered C, get psychiatric help. In this particular case, we ran out of fuel, and when that happens, only a small percentage of your aircraft will be able to fly. The rest will stay grounded, meaning that those that take off will be gangbanged by the opposing side. On that note, B is also a possibility, as having more aircraft than an airport can support will give you huge penalties. Since strategic bombing can damage airports and you can prioritize targeting airports, this could potentially help you turn the tides in your favor. The best thing is that tactical bombers can also be designed to have strategic bombing capabilities, so when we get to the part where we design airplanes, we'll cover that as well. While we're still in this window, you might have noticed that France only had 61% air detection since the beginning, which means that it cannot engage all opposing aircraft as it simply cannot find them. This again gives a battle advantage to the UK as they have diligently built radar stations. Another thing that can increase your detection is control over the territory that the air battle is fought over. This is to simulate ground observer spotting aircraft, so there is a thing such as home advantage here. The last couple of tips that I want to give you in terms of range are to move your aircraft as closest to the center of the strategic air zone if you see that you don't have enough range and thus have lower mission efficiency. This of course will mean that you have to capture the airport in enemy territory, but if you're defending, you should always have a positional advantage, so use it and don't get carried away fighting on the ground, and just manage your air fleet as well. Also, if you have 20 command power to spare, you can press the more ground cruise button to increase your efficiency. So with range out of the way, it's time to discuss 3 stats that are fairly easy to understand, even though the weight and thrust, of course, the tooltips are misleading. For supply use, every plane that I've designed has a 0.28 supply use requirement. Doesn't matter if it's a small airframe like a small fighter or a big strategic bomber. Each and every plane has a supply use of 0.28. Where they do differ is fuel usage. So the bigger the airplane you design and the more engines you include, your fuel usage will go up. Usually supply use is not that crucial as your airports will be behind enemy lines, but keep in mind if the front line reaches an airport or it's close to an airport and you have many airplanes there, it can cause a strain on your ground troops. As for weight and thrust, when you add components to an airplane such as weapons and so on, it will add weight to your airplane, which will kind of reduce your max speed, but not by much. Let's see, if we remove the secondary weapons here, which are quad heavy machine guns, you will see that the max speed jumps with 6 kilometers, which is not all that much to be honest, and given that your air attack suffers that much from 36 to 24, it's not worth it to reduce the weight that way so we can get a bit more max speed. It just doesn't make sense. When we go to thrust, here we see again a rather misleading tooltip. That's I cannot find any other excuse for it. So what does it say here? Thrust represents the ability of the engine to propel the airplane. Any thrust exceeding weight adds extra speed, right? Before it used to work like that, but they changed it in a patch and now it doesn't. So yeah, don't trust the tooltip here. And let me show you why. We have a single engine here. The small airframe can support up to 2 engines. So if we add, let's say, a dual engine type 3, you will see that the thrust is increased. Magically adding another engine won't increase the weight. I don't know how that works, but see how the max speed is further decreased, in fact, when you add more thrust, which is absolutely the opposite of what the tooltip says. In general, when you're designing small airframes, always stick to a single engine, because the thrust and weight ratio does not matter anymore. All that matters is for you to have enough thrust to support the weight. So if the weight exceeds your thrust, your airplane won't be able to take off, and that's a problem. But if it's under it, you're good to go. Also, it doesn't make sense to add dual engines, because see what happens to the production cost from 35 per airplane to 51. That's a huge increase in production cost. And of course, if you want to maintain air superiority, you gotta have numbers on your side. Next up, we have air defense. This stat is good and you should want to bump it up whenever possible, but in practice, modules that give you other stats tend to push air defense out during the design phase. For example, when you're building fighters, air attack, agility, max speed, and range take priority in most cases. I would advise adding self-sealing fuel tanks that add 6 air defense and don't mess up your range if you can afford the extra rubber cost. Yet if you want to put on some extra armor, you're going to sacrifice range and or air attack, because these slots down here are limited. This is where you have to anticipate how the war will evolve and determine whether you will end up defending and at what point will that happen. As I mentioned before, you can use your positional advantage when you're on the back foot. So if you're playing multiplayer versus the Axis, for example, you'll be on the back foot with the Soviets, France, China, etc., assuming the Axis players are good. So for these countries, yeah, prioritize air defense over range if the latter is not that much of a factor. As for bombers and close air support, I'm going to recommend not bothering with air defense too much, as you ideally want to have your fighters protecting you during bombing runs. It would have been neat for air defense to actually protect you from ground-based anti-aircraft battalions and static AA, but that's not the case. So it's best to choose modules that add more ground damage and range and rely on your fighters for protection in the air. On that note, you should be doing close air support and bombing missions when you have established at least 60% air superiority, preferably more. Otherwise, you run the risk of being disrupted and you end up losing a lot of aircraft, which can be pretty expensive in the case of tactical and strategic bombers. As for air superiority, small airframes have a value of 1, heavy fighters on medium airframes have 1.25, so they project air power better, yet they're more expensive than light fighters, and this extra 25% doesn't really make up for it, but it's nice, I guess. Large airframes have only 0.01 air superiority, so don't expect to drop nukes in a defended region without escorts to back them up. Naval attack and targeting. These stats are fairly easy to understand. Your naval attack is how much damage you're going to inflict on an enemy ship, while boosting the naval targeting stat increases your chance to land a hit on ships in the first place, because that doesn't always happen. Both are important for a naval bomber, and adding torpedo mountings increases these stats when you do port and naval strikes. I would suggest having some of your scout planes or naval bombers do naval patrols whenever you do naval strikes, as finding ships can often be a hassle in big sea zones, and you can't hit what you can't find, you know? Ground attack. I'm not certain how exactly ground attack is calculated. If somebody can dig up the formula, do let me know and I'll put it in the pinned comment. What I do know is that the damage ground attack does scales based on the division's HP stats. So stacking a lot of tanks in a division, for example, will make it a lot more vulnerable to ground attack, meaning that you should balance things out with infantry that adds more HP. Also, ground attack can be reduced by up to 75% if you have enough anti-aircraft in your divisions. The next big thing about ground attack is that there is such a thing as air combat width, which limits how many planes can bomb divisions at the same time. So no, putting 5,000 CAS over the Benelux region does not mean that all of them will bomb the enemy. According to the latest information, 3 planes can bomb per 1 combat width of a battle. So a battle that takes 90 combat width can theoretically be bombed by 270 airplanes, which I suspect is rounded up to 300, as one air wing at full strength is currently capped at 100 planes. In other words, all of these YouTubers suggesting that you should not build tactical bombers are full of donkey dung, as flying tactical bombers in really important areas will let you do the most damage, since you can't bomb with everything that you send in an air zone. That's not to say that you shouldn't prioritize CAS as a major country, as you will need cheap aircraft doing damage on many fronts, but if you really want to maximize your firepower in a certain area, having a few tactical bomber wings can be beneficial, because they have more open module slots that allow you to put more ground attack per plane. Strat bombing. With strat bombing, you would assume that more is better, and it is, but only up to a certain extent. This stat is capped at 100, but air doctrines and spirits of the Air Force modifiers do boost it up past that. I would suggest designing strat bombers that have any anywhere between 70 and 100 strat bombing when you do the missions. You need to find a nice middle ground between this stat and production cost, and I'll give you some tips in the design section. Reliability. Reliability. Airframes typically start with 80%, and at this level you're going to experience some breakdowns and accidents, which will cause you to lose a small portion of the aircraft that you send out. The gremlins are real. The voices in your head were right all along. You're definitely not a schizo. While you do have some aircraft designers that can increase reliability up to 100%, it's not worth it in all honesty, as the combat stats that you get from other designers are just too good to miss out on. Fuel usage. That's pretty self-explanatory. The stat tracks how much fuel will a single airplane use up. Smaller planes with less engines are more economical, while the big chunky boys with 4 or more engines are real gas guzzlers. It's worth noting that planes won't spend any fuel while standing by, only when you send them on missions. This is different compared to your ground divisions, which will spend a small portion of your fuel even while they're doing nothing. Surface and sub detection. These two stats are related to an airplane's ability to find enemy ships and subs. And by subs I mean submarines, not what the daily special is at Subway. From what I understand, 1 point of surface detection gives you a plus 0.3% chance of spotting naval vessels every 8 hours, which isn't huge, but since it happens 3 times per day, it's still decent. Meanwhile, every point in sub detection gives you a plus 1.8% chance of spotting a sub, although keep in mind that the enemy's sub visibility and surface detection stats will also play a big part when the game tries to determine if you'll find something to bomb or not. When designing airplanes, you can include floats and air-ground radars to improve these two stats, and again, you can do other things to improve your chances of hitting, such as sending out planes on naval recon, infiltrating the enemy's navy for better intel, and so on. Night penalty. This is another one that can confuse new players as it sits at 0%, which leads many people to think that their airplanes don't have a night penalty. But that's not the way she goes, boyos. In essence, this means that you don't have any reduction to the nighttime penalty, which applies a third of the time when you have planes doing missions. When you put in modules like radio navigation, you'll see that the penalty turns to a -%. By default, the night penalty reduces your detection by 20%, while bombers doing ground bombing receive a -50% modifier. On their own, modules don't reduce the penalty that much, but keep in mind that you also have doctrines like night bombing and even certain ministers that can further reduce this penalty, so you can bomb more effectively while suffering less casualties in the cover of the night. And finally, minelaying and minesweeping. These determine your effectiveness when mining and demining C-zone. But again, the aircraft techs that allow you to do these missions are researched fairly late, and planes are not too effective in doing them compared to destroyers. So I suggest not bothering with aerial mining operations altogether. Woo! We finally finished one of the most important and confusing parts of air combat, so pat yourself on the back. I personally feel stained, so if you excuse me, I gotta go perform the gentleman's rinse. And that's an euphemism for washing your ding-dong in the sink. Alright, let's do something easier and quickly go over the air missions. First off, we have pilot exercises. You can use this one to make your air wings more experienced. When you first create an air wing, it will always start at level 1 rookie, and as you can see, it comes with a fair bit of stat reductions. By using pilot exercises, you can go up to level 3 and turn these penalties into bonuses, which is why it's always useful to do pilot exercises before the start of the war. Still, keep in mind that exercising uses up fuel and can cause air accidents, so don't do it longer than necessary. When you do a shift and left click on this mission, your air wings will stop exercising as soon as they hit level 3. Lastly, if you disband an air wing, it will lose all of the experience it has accumulated, so don't do it in general. Keep in mind that the planes will be returned to the stockpile and you can use them and lose them at a later point. Next up, we have air superiority. We covered this one extensively already. It's the mission you use to try and achieve dominance over the strategic air zones. When you use your fighters on air superiority, this mission will also escort and protect your bombers doing ground missions. Close air support. This one is used to bomb enemy troops in active combat and won't work if you don't have any active battles going. Let me repeat, if the army is not fighting, you won't be bombing with close air support. It's worth noting that if you have fighters with bombing capabilities, you will still be able to project air superiority, in some cases even better than the air superiority mission itself. So do try it if one day you decide to run multi-role aircraft. Interception. This mission can be quite useful in certain situations, but it's a bit niche. Fighters put on interception won't engage an enemy air fleet unless it includes bombers. On interception, you will not project any air superiority, so it doesn't make sense to do it if you want to provide cover for your armies. That being said, you will save a lot of fuel when doing interception, as your fighters won't take off unless there are bombers to hunt. Also, fighters on interception tend to trade a bit better compared to those on air superiority, but keep in mind that there are lots of factors such as doctrines, range, and detection that can tilt the scales here. I suggest using interception in areas that you want to defend which are not in imminent danger of being invaded, such as the Ruhr industrial area in Germany, or trying to protect the home isles as Britain while there are no land battles going on. Strat bombing. This is the one that lets you destroy basically every building in the game, from infrastructure and industry to radars, ports, and even nuclear stations. Keep in mind that small airframes do not have the strategic bombing mission available to them, so you need to construct medium or large airframes if you want to strategically bomb. Including modules that add to the strat bombing stat will improve your capabilities, and so will doctrines. The crosshair icon that you see to the right on strategic bombing allows you to set priorities on the buildings you want to destroy the most. Naval strike is used to attack enemy ships in a sea zone, and so is Kamikaze strike, which is more effective but it destroys more of your airplanes. As for port strikes, these are intended for bombing enemy fleets while they are in port. A lot of people wonder whether to target a land or naval province with port strikes. You target the land, as the ports are part of the land. Logistical strikes. This mission is quite powerful as it targets trains, trucks, and railroads, which are vital for supplying armies. If you destroy the enemy supply lines, their armies will enter an extended fasting state, and you can use the opportunity to encircle and defeat them before the world comes together to organize a Live Aid concert for them. This mission will also bomb enemy troops, but it has some drawbacks, such as the fact that you need to rebuild all the infrastructure you've destroyed after you advance, and that planes put on logistical strikes are wrecked by anti-aircraft installations, so don't do it in areas that have a lot of AA. Air supply. This one requires transport planes, which are also used for paradrop missions. As of early 2023, air supply is not powerful at all, and I'd advise you to not bother with it for the most part, unless you're swimming in fuel and can afford the luxury of gaining a small advantage in an area short in supplies. Naval minelaying and sweeping. Not much to say here. To do these, you need to design aircraft with modules that allow for minelaying and sweeping, which are researched fairly late in game. And whatever you do, you're probably not going to be as effective compared to a destroyer that's specialized in minelaying or sweeping. Air recon requires purpose-built scout planes that need to have this camera module on board. Doing aerial scouting will increase the intel percentage of the country you target, and this can be seen in the diplomacy screen. At most, scout planes can add 20 to 30% to the intel level in a given area. Having a bigger intel advantage gives your divisions a bonus to soft and hard attack, as well as defense or breakthrough, although this bonus is not as big compared to those given by air superiority and close air support. Finally, we have naval patrol, which makes enemy fleets easier to spot, something that will help both your naval bombers and your navy to engage the enemy. As for the buttons here, this one creates a new air group or theater, and you can use it to set the replacement priority for various air wings. These two split and merge your air wings, and this one merges air groups. When you have air wings selected, you can use the 4 buttons here to tell the game how you want to reinforce losses. With outdated planes, with outdated and current designs, with only contemporary models, and with specialized air wings, meaning that the air wing will only reinforce with airplanes from a specific type that is already in the air wing itself. So if you have specialized bombers for whatever purpose, setting specialized air wing will allow the group to reinforce only with bombers or planes of that kind. This one allows you to select the equipment tag, and this one gives you the option to stop air wings from attacking if they are below 25 or 50% strength. With this one, you can select whether to attack 24/7 or only during the day or night time. And this button selects all the air wings in an air group. You can use this button or the shortcut S to select half of the currently selected air wings, while the stop sign or shortcut key H will stop all selected air wings from performing their missions, which is quite useful. So if there is going to be 2 shortcuts that you want to learn here, it's gonna be S and H. Lastly, this one removes your selection from an air group or theater, and this button is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, air missions are done. I have successfully lulled you into a false sense of security. And just when the slight glimmer of hope has started incubating in the crevices of your soul, I shall deliver my coup de grace. That's right, friend. I'm about to dump a huge steaming pile of bewildering, perplexing, and dare I say, paradoxical terminology right on your chest because it's time to talk about air doctrines. And just to give you a tiny whiny tease, this is not at all the same as that, and that has nothing to do with that other thing over here. To understand air doctrines, you first have to understand that your general mission efficiency is not at all connected to the mission efficiency modifiers you're going to see when you look around in the air doctrine screen. If you remember from earlier, the mission efficiency in the strategic air window refers to how many of the aircraft you have sent to an air zone are actually in range and doing the mission you've selected. The mission efficiency in the air doctrines refers to other things, so let's start reviewing the most curious terms one by one, starting off with ground support. Ground support. So what does ground support mean? It is what you see as the air support modifiers that boost the soft and hard attack of your divisions, as well as their defense or breakthrough. Whenever you research a doctrine that adds to ground support, you raise the cap or maximum percentage gain from these modifiers, and I'm fairly certain the maximum cap is plus 35%. Air superiority, when we talk about just the straight up air superiority plus 15% like we have here in logistical bombing, works pretty much like ground support. This is a ground modifier which reduces the enemy's defense or breakthrough and the movement speed of their divisions. So getting additional air superiority will raise the ceiling to the modifiers that the enemy gets, right? This has nothing to do with the air superiority that we've discussed in the strategic air window. Rather, it's a bonus to a modifier that your enemy divisions get. Of course, the modifier increases as you get more air dominance, but here air superiority only refers to the bonus modifier, if that makes sense. Fighter detection. This one makes it more likely to find any type of airplane while you are on the air superiority mission. It doesn't only give you better detection against fighters. Interception detection. This increases the chance to detect enemy aircraft only while you're on the interception mission. Air support mission efficiency. Now we gotta talk about this one. You know what? Screw it. It's time for another bonus game. What does air support mission efficiency do? Does it A, increase the air combat with modifier, so more bombers can damage a division at the same time? B, reduce the casualties that airplanes sustain from ground-based and divisional anti-aircraft while they're doing close air support? Or C, it's a broken stat that does nothing but enrage those who try to figure out what it does. So, what do you think? Well, the answer is D, so gotcha there, but you always gotta watch out for the D. In all honesty, I almost declared it a broken stat after hours of testing that seemed to yield zero results. Good thing that I found the truth in the Paradox forums. Air support mission efficiency basically improves how good airplanes on the close air support mission will perform in dogfights or against enemy fighters. This can be tactical bombers, the classical CAS, or even something dirty like a multi-role fighter. The crazy thing about this stat is that you can increase this mission efficiency to a whopping 165% using the battlefield support doctrine and the continuous strike air spirit. Then you just slap one bombing module on a fighter model and put it on close air support, and the fighter will absolutely demolish enemy aircraft while bombing ground troops. Now, there's a catch to this imbalanced strategy, a few of them to be exact. The first thing is that you need to have ground troops to bomb in order to perform close air support missions. Otherwise, you'll have to do air superiority and you won't have the 165% mission efficiency there. Also, you won't be able to use the 165% modifier over neutral strategic zones such as the English Channel and every other sea zone. Now, this strategy will probably get patched in the future because it's ridiculously strong in the right conditions, but have fun with it while you can. Then we get to air superiority mission efficiency. This one improves your dogfighting capability when you have planes on the air superiority mission. It works the same way as air support mission efficiency, which we discussed just now. Interception mission efficiency. Same thing goes here. It improves the capabilities of your fighters when they are on the interception mission and while they are dogfighting. If you're looking for a broken modifier that does not work, look no further than escort efficiency. This thing does nothing anymore as there is no longer an escort mission because it has been sort of merged with air superiority. Naval mission efficiency. This one is different as it does actually give you something resembling a damage bonus when your planes do naval and port strikes. Strategic bombing visibility. It's the chance of being detected by the enemy when on a strategic bombing mission. So getting this one will make your bombers harder to detect by the enemy. As for bomber defense, it kind of plays like an extra boost to the air defense stat of your bombers, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't work on CAS. There are a few other terms here, but I feel that they're largely self-explanatory and the game has done a well enough job for them to be explained clearly to the player, so I'll skip them over. Alright, now that we know all the terminology, it's time to determine which is the best air doctrine path of the three. If you are in a really sweaty multiplayer scenario versus a tryhard, and winning the fighter versus fighter air war is an absolute must, a fully researched operational integrity tree is probably the best thing you could do. That's because this path gives you the biggest fighter detection boost, or plane detection boost, 20% versus 15 or 10 with the other doctrines, and its interception and air superiority mission efficiencies are equal to the other two trees. However, and this is a purely subjective opinion here, I also feel like operational integrity is the most boring doctrine tree of them all. So in every other case, feel free to use whatever pleases you. The trio of doctrine paths are fairly balanced in my opinion, so do whatever you like. If you plan to focus on strategic and naval bombing, go for strategic destruction. If you want to get the best bonus modifiers for your army, battlefield support is the way to go. And who's to say that the better damage boost that you get from your divisions through battlefield support won't be more beneficial for you than being slightly better in air-to-air combat with operational integrity. My personal favorite is battlefield support, and that's how I roll most of the time. Now that we know what all these stats and modifiers mean, it's time to take a look at the best aircraft designers, ministers, and spirits of the Air Force, starting with designer companies. So in terms of aircraft designers, 9 times out of 10 you'd want to go for the light aircraft designer. After all, fighters are the backbone of your air fleet, and getting a 10% bonus for your agility and max speed is really useful. That being said, if you run multi-role aircraft that you've designed as CAS, they won't get the bonus from the light aircraft designer even though they are with fighting capabilities. So there you can go for a CAS designer to improve their bombing and reliability. There are also niche scenarios where going for a range designer can be quite cool. As Japan, you can stack a lot of range modifiers to your naval bombers slash heavy fighters. And by the way, medium airframes, they can be classified as a naval bomber, but you can still do pretty well when you naval bomb. And by doing this, one of the interesting things you could do is, for example, reaching Pearl Harbor from your 1936 territory. So you can do naval and port strikes from land. No need scaras, right? And you know, if you want to go heavy on the strategic bombing, it might make sense to go for Boink or an equivalent to stat that extra strat bombing modifier. In terms of chiefs of the Air Force, I really like Air Reformer because they give you bonus extra experience, which will allow you to blitz through your doctrine tree before the start of the war. So be on the lookout for them, especially in the case of the Soviet Union and the USA, which have genius air reformers. If you know any other countries that have genius air reformers, let me know in the comments below. I'll fake my interest, just like your girl fakes it in bed. As if you have a girl or a bed. And after you're done grinding XP with air reformers, you can switch to something like ground support if you have it available, because it will apply a bigger defense or breakthrough debuff to enemy armies and also reduce their speed, which is much more useful than reducing your chances of getting air accidents or having your planes fare slightly better in bad weather conditions. In terms of air ministers in the military high command, they will compete with ministers for the army and navy, and you do have to determine whether it's worth going for an air minister over getting buffs for your troops or ships. One of the air ministers that I really like is tactical bombing, which adds ground support. If you remember, ground support adds to the attack and defense of your divisions, so it's effectively a noticeable army buff for everything that you have, every division that you have. So as long as you have air superiority and can bomb, this minister is a must, and perhaps even takes priority over the army ones, as again it adds to the stats of all your divisions that are supported by your air force, not just infantry or tanks. Some of the countries that have tactical bombing ministers include the USA and Japan, and I'm sure there's more as well. In terms of the air superiority and close air support ministers, ministers, there was this misconception that they didn't do anything as the stat bonuses they gave didn't work on neutral air zones such as the English Channel and the Benelux region. However, they do work on friendly and enemy territory, as confirmed by 71 Cloak, and for all I know, this might have been fixed for the neutral territories as well. So yes, they do give bonuses and you might want to consider them if you're going fighter or multi-role heavy with your airboat. For Spirits of the Air Force, we have a few that are quite good here. Air Crew Surveys is really good as it reduces your doctrine's cost by 15% and gives you a reduced chance of having air accidents. That being said, you will generally want to rush the 1940 light airframes if you're serious about winning the air wars, so Industry Liaisons is also quite good. Meanwhile, if you're playing with a major that can send volunteers to Spain or China, Independent Air Force is quite good as it will save you political power. This one reduces the political power cost of both your Chiefs of the Air Force and your Air Ministers. And that's a lot of political power saved. And after you get that sweet PP coupon deal, you can switch to one of the air spirits that I previously mentioned. But yes, for these ones, if you do have the air experience to spare, which is often the case when you send volunteers to Spain and China, don't be afraid to switch things up and get the maximum out of these 3 air spirits. For the Spirit of the Air Force Command, centralized control is really good for that plus 10% plane detection and plus 10% buff to any air mission you do. Still, if you run the multi-role build like the dirty cheat that you are, Continuous Strike, which is unlocked by choosing the battlefield support path, is an absolute must. And if you want to do something out of the box, you can try getting the 8th generation buffs from the right battlefield support branch or the operational integrity path and combine it with airborne heroes. It could be a great way to improve the stats of your entire air force, as you will be able to generate a larger number of aces and make them more effective by 50%. Woo! We dove so hard into the anal cavity of air combat, whoever pulls us out of there can be crowned King Arthur. You stuck with me for over 15 minutes, bud, so props to you. That's longer than my dad did before he went out to buy cigarettes on the day I was born. So, I got a reward for you. It's finally time to discuss the airplane designer and see which are the best models for single and multiplayer. Let's start with the basics. You can access the aircraft designer by going to the production screen, shortcut key here is Y. In this window, you'll see all the airframes you have available and some models that your country starts off with. Now click on the create variant button and the designer will show up. The first really important thing to remember is that the game determines the type of airplane that you're building by looking at the very first weapon or armament slot, which is right here. If you have a fighter weapon here, the game considers this a fighter. If you put bombs on a small airframe, now it's a CAS. If you go for torpedoes, now it's a naval bomber. With more advanced airframes, more weapon slots will be unlocked here. But even if you put 2 bomb locks or small bomb bays on a small airframe, the game will still consider it a fighter if you have a fighter weapon in the first slot. And this fact really matters when you're trying to build multi-role aircraft. For example, you could do 2 heavy machine guns and a bomb block, and the game will consider this a fighter, meaning that it will get buffed by the Messerschmitt light aircraft designer, which will give it agility and max speed. If you did the reverse and put the bomb locks or bomb bay first, this would make it a CAS, meaning that it won't be able to get the modifiers here, but it will be able to benefit from the close air support, ground attack, and reliability boosts. And also air doctrines like this one, which increases your CAS agility by 20%. That's why I'm repeating myself here, because a lot of people have this wrong and don't understand how this works. And just to get some things out of the way for new players, after you're done designing the aircraft, assuming you have enough air experience, this button will be highlighted in green, and it will allow you to save the model that you've created. If this button is grayed out and you have enough air experience, this means that something that you did with your design is not right, and usually when you hover your pointer over here, it will show you what needs to be changed so you could save your aircraft model. After you save your model, it will show up here. Then you assign military factories on it and it will start producing the airplane. From there, you can just click on any airport, click on this icon here, add new air wing. It will be available when you have aircraft in reserve, and from there on, you will be able to deploy your aircraft. Most air wings have a maximum size of 100 airplanes, and if it's under that, it will show like so. The only exception is scout planes, which have an air wing size of 10. And basically, this is how your air force becomes available for action. Now, let's look at the top designs you can build. I'm gonna gonna restrict myself to using 1940 technology, as this will make up the bulk of your air forces throughout the war. Once you research something better, use it, but the general philosophy remains the same. We're starting off with the meta fighter model for multiplayer. Everyone is after this one, even though telemetry shows that the vast majority of players stick to single player, so go figure. What we're looking at here is the infamous Kamikaze design that was proclaimed as the best fighter in the big YouTuber competition that Feedback Gaming did. It relies on triple heavy machine guns for weapons, 2 armor plates, and a heavy defense turret. At first glance, this seems like a great model, as it's relatively cheap to produce, it has great agility and max speed, good air attack, and really decent air defense. However, there is one big, and I mean huge, stat that is ignored here. Care to guess what it is? That's right, it's time for range rage. If you watched the part where I covered range as a stat, you remember that range is absolutely crucial for your general air mission efficiency, which determines what percentage of the planes you send to an air zone will be able to engage the enemy. And this plane has a tiny whiny range of 720 kilometers. That wasn't an issue for Feedback Gaming, as he did the test over the Benelux region. But if you, I don't know, zoom out, you'll see that this is one of the smallest air regions in the freaking game. Look at Egypt, look at the Soviet Union, look at the Pacific. Even the English Channel is more than twice as large compared to the Benelux region. In other words, by ignoring this one stat, the test becomes unrealistic, and the best quote-unquote fighter model is not that good unless you use it in really, and I mean really specific situations. Imagine being the world's greatest lover but having a tiny that can only satisfy really tight puss. Would you prefer that or having a bigger ding-dong that does a pretty good job regardless of what you throw at it? In all fairness, I'm not trying to diss Kamikaze here, as he likely understood how the test was going to be performed and designed a plane that excels considering its limitations. Range was not a factor here, so he didn't bother with it, but that leaves a lot of players with the wrong impression. Still, we have a few simple fixes that will produce the ultimate fighter for you. Step 1. Replace one of the armor plates with self-sealing fuel tanks if you can afford it. This one costs an extra rubber per factory that you use, so the rubber cost can really stack up. However, it does not reduce your range by 10%, and it gives you 2 extra air defense. Step 2. Replace the second armor plate with drop tanks. This way your range is improved by almost 500 kilometers. That's an increase of 40%, and you only lose out on 2 air defense along the way. I would take that deal any day. If you don't have the rubber to spare, just swap the self-sealing fuel tanks with an armor plate. That will still net you a range of well over 1,000 kilometers. And if you need a great defensive fighter that can use the positional advantage of being at a central airport, you can do 1 armor plate and 1 self-sealing fuel tank. Still better range than the original design, but I really probably wouldn't go as low here. I prefer having range over 1,000 kilometers. I've returned the drop tanks here, and now we're gonna talk about the weapons. There's also a case to be made to replace one of the heavy machine guns for dual cannons 1. This will make the fighter roughly 7.5% more expensive, meaning that you'll be outnumbered if your industrial capacity is equal to the enemy. For 50,000 IC invested, the enemy will probably have another extra air wing. However, nothing in Hearts of Iron 4 is equal, so if you want a fighter that is better at shooting down bombers and trades really well against the triple heavy MG build, replacing one of the heavy machine guns with dual cannons 1 is a viable option. Let's talk about multi-rolls. If you want to do a successful multi-roll run, you need to have the continuous strike air spirit here. And you need to go down the battlefield support doctrine to get that 65% bonus to mission efficiency when you do the close air support mission. You need to have active ground battles to do close air support properly. That's one of the drawbacks of this strat. Still, it works ridiculously well in single player, and it can also work in multiplayer against somebody who is not aware of how to counter multi-rolls. If you're wondering how to counter it, one of the things you can do is fighting over neutral sea zones like the English Channel whenever possible, or by doing logistical strikes supported by your fighters behind enemy lines. That way you will draw away the multi-rolls from the front line, and you will force them to switch missions from close air support to interception or air superiority, which will remove the huge boost to the modifier that they get. So once you got your air doctrines, the air spirit, and the 1940 airframe researched, you design an aircraft similar to this one. I don't recommend doing multi-roll focus on a 1936 airframe as there aren't enough weapon slots and you want this thing to be decent against fighters. You can choose to either classify it as CAS or as a fighter depending on which weapon you choose to put here. And as we stated previously, this will affect which bonuses you can get from an aircraft designer and from your doctrines. In terms of CAS weapons, you can go for any of these. I like the small bomb bay because it gives you -15 agility when you do CAS missions as opposed to -20 when you do close air support, and you want to do close air support as much as possible. Also, the small bomb bay gives you 2 extra ground attack compared to bomb locks. If you want to completely eliminate the agility penalty, researching rocket rails, which requires the 1940 rocket arty tech, will do wonders for you. And in single player, you can remove one of these modules here and go for non-strategic materials use. This will reduce your aluminium use per factory by 2, which is massive, and it will also reduce the production cost at the cost of air defense, essentially making this into a spammable glass cannon that the AI will struggle massively against. And reducing the aluminum costs by 2 per factory will allow you to do things like going free trade with Germany without having to sacrifice that many of your civilian factories to trade for aluminum. As for a good dedicated CAS model, you want to go dual bomb base and a bomb block because you're not allowed to have 3 small bomb bays on this frame. Afterwards, you want the best possible engine, drop tanks, increases the range, dive brakes, gives you extra defense when you do close air support missions, and the optional self-sealing fuel tanks if you're really swimming in rubber, which is rarely the case. This way you get great ground attack and range plus a really good 21 air defense when you're doing the close air support mission. Again, in single player, if you want to spam these out, you can also go for non-strategic materials used to make the aircraft cheaper in aluminum and production cost. Next up, we have light naval bombers. These are a really good option for multiplayer in areas such as the Mediterranean, as they have decent range, which comes from drop tanks and extra fuel tanks. They get floats, which increases their subdetection and surface detection, and this one torpedo module is all you really need to get some decent attack against ships. And considering that people in multiplayer tend to go heavy on the anti-aircraft guns, a lot of your aircraft will be shot down. So making this one as cheap as possible with decent enough range and with decent enough attack is going to be your best bet here. If you need more range, for example as Japan or as the USA or as Britain in the Atlantic, this is a good quote-unquote medium naval bomber. As we said again, medium airframes for whatever reason cannot be classified as naval bombers, so first you need to input either a fighter weapon here or a medium bomb bay, which is a tactical armament, which does add to port strike, which is why I like it, and also add strategic bombing. And then you can add 2 torpedoes here, and with this one you have a really good range of over 3,000 kilometers. You also have dual engines instead of 3 or quad engines, making it, I would say, cost effective if you want to put it that way. You have a flying boat, which increases your surface and sub detection, and you have 2 extra fuel tanks that add a total of 30% extra range. And if you don't need that much range, you can just remove one or both of them. Okay, heavy fighters. As we said previously, no matter what heavy fighter design you do, when range is not that much of an issue, a light airframe would always beat a heavy fighter by a mile because it has much better agility and usually better max speed, which is enough to give it the max speed damage bonus as well. What you really need heavy fighters for is range. That's what they excel at. So in situations where you need to escort bombers, where you need to shoot down bombers because they have greater air attack due to the extra weapon slots, or where you're simply fighting over a really big area such as Egypt and you need that range, a heavy fighter will be the way to go. And I like this model because it has quad machine guns. Going for cannons is viable, but then again you already have only 35 agility, which is going to be almost twice as less compared to what the fighters have. So you don't want to reduce your agility too much, although the agility damage debuff has a cap. Still, I would rather leave agility at 35 and just go with heavy machine guns here. The other thing is you can still run dual engines here, which is quite good. You don't need to spend more IC on a triple or quad engine setup, which really increases your price. If you have the rubber to spare, go with self-sealing fuel tanks so you don't reduce the range. It adds 8 air defense, which is quite good on the medium airframe, and you can use 1 armor plate here because having range range over 2,000 kilometers is really good. You can even remove the armor plates here if you want that extra range and to make the aircraft a bit cheaper. What else do we have on the medium airframe? Tactical bombers. Okay, for tactical bombers, you want something that can do a little bit of everything. And tactical bombers can, which is great about them. The design that I really like here involves medium bomb base, dual small bomb base, and a bomb blocks. You can go heavier with the weapons, but keep in mind that your weight and thrusts are pretty close to being on par here. And you don't want to include triple or quad engines because it will increase your production costs by a lot. What I also like to put on the tactical bombers is this, which is the radio navigation 2. It will add to your strat bombing and it will reduce your nighttime penalty on any mission that you get. And again, you can play with the armor plates here if you want that extra defense. You can even remove them if you want that extra range. But this is really, really good. It gives you 25 ground attack, which is great, more than a CAS. It gives you some strategic bombing, which can be used to bomb enemy airfields and radars. You can bomb ships, you can bomb ports, you can do logistical strike, you have great range, and all of this is included in a semi-affordable package. And lastly, we have scout planes. Ideally, you want to make scout planes as cheap as possible. Light airframes, for whatever reason, don't have the ability to host this camera module, but medium airframes do. So if you want to build a nice scout plane, just include one of these cameras, get the cheapest possible engine, which is going to be engine 1, and you're going to have really good range. Your air defense, air attack, agility, max speed, they don't matter. You only want to scout with this plane, so that's what you're gonna do. And the production cost is quite attractive at 37, meaning that the production cost is on par with most light aircraft that you're going to build, even cheaper perhaps. So for me, this is the best scout plane. And finally, we have strat bombers. With the 1940 techs, for me, this is the best thing you could do. You got 4 large bomb bays up top, quad engines here of the Type 3, which is the 1941, and a radio navigation 2, which will also increase your strat bombing and reduce your night penalty. This has a really attractive production cost of 123.5 and has a strategic bombing value of 66. Now you can theoretically go for another large bomb bay, but this means that you will have to go for 6 engines of the Type 3, and this increases your production cost to 160. I did the calculations. Going with the cheaper bomber will give you overall more strategic bombing for its IC cost. So yes, go with 4 engines and just forget about this bomb bay. Keep in mind that even though I'm restricting myself to using 1940 tech or strategic bombers, the 1941 and 1942 radar technologies unlock really good techs. This is what the 1941 radar technology will unlock for you. Air Ground Radar 1. It will give you another 4 strategic bombing. It will further reduce your night penalty by 30%, and it will add some surface detection and sub detection. And the Air Ground Radar 2 from the 1942 tech, it's even better than this one. So I would suggest, if you're doing strategic bombers, try to rush the radar techs as well, because the air ground radars are a really good component to have on strategic bombers, and you want to get them as soon as possible. And lastly, we have a bit of a meme model here. This thing is ridiculous when it comes to range, over 6,000 kilometers. You have triple torpedo mountings, a lot of extra fuel tanks, and the flying boat for that extra sub detection and surface detection. You can also switch the flying boat with the air ground radar if you have the tech researched. Would you look at that? You made it till the end of the video, so I'd like to personally thank you for joining me along for the ride. What you saw in just over an hour took me around 2 weeks to make, and you could really hear the struggle in my voice near the end. If you found this info useful and God forbid entertaining, please like and subscribe. I would hugely appreciate that. And if you're really feeling generous, you can send me a donation over PayPal. I've left the link in the description because I'm a shameless Balkan man. Now make daddy proud and go wreck some noobs. Adios.